Every case deserves an answer. Every family deserves the truth. For nearly 40 years, a single test tube sat in an evidence locker in Santa Clara County, holding the answer to a question that had haunted a family since 1982. In April of 2022, a detective who had never met Karen Stitt obtained a small sample of DNA from a stranger's grandchild in Hawaii. The lab results came back with a phrase that would finally end 4 decades of silence: a high probability of paternity. The man whose blood had been left on a murdered 15-year-old girl in 1982 had been found, not through a fingerprint, not through a confession, but through the DNA of a grandchild who had no idea their family tree held the answer to one of California's most disturbing cold cases. His name was Gary Jean Ramirez. He was 75 years old, living quietly on the island of Maui, and he had no criminal record at all. For 40 years, he had simply been a name no one knew to look for. That was about to change. Before we go further, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. Someone watching might live near where this case went cold. That person might remember something. Karen Stitt was the new girl in town. In the early 1980s, her family relocated from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to Palo Alto, California. And by all accounts, Karen adjusted quickly. She enrolled at Palo Alto High School, and within a short time, she had learned the rhythms of a completely different world. The buses that connected the South Bay's sprawling suburbs, the social scene of a California high school, the particular geography of El Camino Real, the long commercial corridor that stitched together Palo Alto, Mountain View, and Sunnyvale. Those who knew her described her as spunky, someone who eased into a new social life with the kind of confidence that made an unfamiliar place feel like home in a matter of months. She had a boyfriend in Sunnyvale, a town just a short bus ride from her father's house in Palo Alto. By September of 1982, 15-year-old Karen had already mastered that commute, riding the bus lines back and forth to see him with the ease of someone who had grown up there her whole life. Karen lived with her father, Robert Stitt. Her mother was Catherine Leszewski. She had an older sister named Suzanne, who would one day carry Karen's ashes to Mount Tamalpais in Mill Valley and scatter them across the mountain that overlooks the Bay Area her sister had only recently come to call home. Karen was 15. She was a high school student figuring out a new city, a new school, a new relationship, the ordinary business of being a teenager in 1982, riding buses at night to see a boyfriend, playing video games at a 7-Eleven, wandering over to the local putt-putt course because there was nowhere else in particular to be. In 1982, that was simply what teenage life in the South Bay looked like: cruising El Camino Real, killing time at a convenience store, borrowing a boyfriend's baseball cap because it was cold, or because it was his, or because that's simply what you did when you were 15, and dating someone in another town. The relationship itself was ordinary too, the kind of high school romance built on video game arcades and putt-putt courses rather than anything more complicated. Karen had a boyfriend in Sunnyvale, and getting to see him meant learning an entire public transit system on her own, at an age when most new arrivals to a place are still asking for directions. She had no way of knowing that Thursday, September 2nd, 1982, would be the last ordinary night of her life. Now that you know who Karen was, does she remind you of anyone? Tell me in the comments. Keeping her memory human keeps these cases alive. Thursday, September 2nd, 1982, played out like countless nights before it. Karen took the bus from Palo Alto to Sunnyvale to spend the evening with her boyfriend. The two of them killed time the way teenagers did in the early 80s, playing video games at a 7-Eleven, then wandering toward Golfland, a popular miniature golf course that drew crowds of local kids on weeknights. There was nothing unusual about the evening. It was the kind of low-key hangout that happened 100 times a year between two teenagers who lived a bus ride apart. Around 12:30 in the morning, Karen's boyfriend walked her to a bus stop at the corner of El Camino Real and South Wolf Road. She planned to catch the 22 bus back to Palo Alto, back to her father's house, the same ride she had made countless times before. Her boyfriend, worried about getting in trouble with his own parents for being out so late, left her there and headed home. He watched her walk toward the stop. That was the last confirmed sighting of Karen Stitt alive. El Camino Real at that hour was not an empty road. It was a corridor, cluttered with restaurants, bars, and a steady stream of cruising cars. The kind of busy, well-traveled strip where a person disappearing without a single witness seems almost impossible. And yet, somewhere along that stretch, In the short window between being dropped off and catching her bus, Karen Stitt vanished. She was wearing a leather jacket, a striped shirt, pants, and her boyfriend's baseball hat, a cap bearing the insignia of the rock band Rush. Every detail of that outfit would later matter. Every detail would end up in a case file investigators returned to again and again over the next 40 years. The next morning, a delivery truck driver made a discovery that would end the search for Karen and begin a search for her killer that would stretch across 4 decades. Her body was found roughly 100 yards from the bus stop where she'd last been seen, thrown over a 4-foot wall near a business called the Honey Bee Restaurant, long since gone from that stretch of road. She was nude. Her wrists had been bound with her own shirt. Her jacket was tied around her left ankle. Nearby, investigators found her boyfriend's Rush baseball cap, the last physical thread connecting the ordinary night she'd had to the horror that ended it. Investigators determined that Karen had been sexually assaulted. She had been stabbed more than 50 times. Some reports from law enforcement put the number as high as 60. Others described the criminal complaints figure as 59. Whatever the precise number, the violence inflicted on a 15-year-old girl walking home from a night with her boyfriend was, in the words of the prosecutors who would eventually put her killer behind bars, brutal and heinous, almost beyond description. A machinist working late that night noticed something that would linger in the case file for the next 40 years. An out-of-place white panel truck, old-fashioned in style, with a stripe running along its side and a rectangular sticker on the bumper. It was parked near where Karen's body would later be found, its parking lights left on. To this day, the full significance of that truck has never been confirmed. It remains one of the small, nagging details that Santa Clara County investigators have continued to ask the public about, decades after the murder. The kind of clue that might mean everything, or might mean nothing, but that no one has ever been able to rule out. For years, the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office kept that detail alive in public appeals, asking anyone who might remember the truck or anything else from that stretch of El Camino Real on the night of September 2, 1982, to come forward. Investigators stressed that even a seemingly insignificant piece of information, something a witness might not have thought to mention at the time, could end up being vital to finally identifying who was responsible. It's a reminder of how cold cases are often kept alive, not by one dramatic breakthrough, but by decades of investigators refusing to let a single loose thread go unexamined. Investigators had a blood and bodily fluid sample from the killer, but the trail went cold for decades. What do you think happened that night on El Camino Real? Drop your theory in the comments. In the earliest days of the investigation, suspicion fell, as it often does, close to home. Karen's boyfriend, the last person known to have seen her alive, was considered a suspect. It's a grim irony of cold cases like this one. The person who loved her, who walked her to that bus stop, worried about his own curfew, spent years under a cloud of suspicion for a crime he did not commit. It wasn't until the early 2000s, when forensic DNA analysis had matured enough to test the biological evidence collected from the crime scene, that Karen's boyfriend was formally cleared. The DNA recovered from her body, blood and bodily fluid left behind by her attacker, belonged to someone else entirely. Unidentified male. A stranger whose genetic profile investigators now had, but whose name they still did not. For years, that DNA profile sat in law enforcement databases, run again and again against the growing pool of convicted offenders in CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database. Nothing ever matched. Whoever had left that blood and bodily fluid on Karen Stitt had no criminal record, nothing that would have put his DNA into any system police could search. The case, despite an ocean of investigative effort, simply had no name to attach to the evidence. It went cold. This is, in many ways, the cruelest kind of cold case. Not one where evidence is missing, but one where the evidence has been sitting there the entire time, correct and complete, waiting for a name that the available technology simply could not produce. Investigators had a genetic fingerprint of Karen's killer as early as the early 2000s. What they didn't have, for nearly 2 more decades, was any way to turn that fingerprint into an identity, because the man responsible had never been arrested for anything, anywhere, that would have required him to submit a DNA sample. For decades, Karen Stitt's family waited. If you've ever waited for justice, in any form, I want to hear about it in the comments. That patience deserves to be acknowledged. The case did not die. It simply waited for technology to catch up to it. In 2019, Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety Detective Matt Hutchison picked the file back up, armed with a tool that had not existed when Karen was killed: investigative genetic genealogy. It was the same method that had cracked open the identity of the Golden State Killer the year before, a technique that takes an unknown suspect's DNA and, instead of searching for a direct match, uses it to build out a family tree, tracing distant relatives who had voluntarily submitted their own DNA to consumer genealogy databases, then narrowing the possibilities branch by branch until a name emerges. It was slow, painstaking work. Genealogy research on the case began in 2019, piecing together a family tree rooted in nothing but a decades-old DNA sample. By 2021, the genealogist working with Hutchison had narrowed the field dramatically, not to one name, but to four. Four brothers, all from Fresno, California. One of them was the source of the DNA left on Karen's body. The genealogist could not yet say which one. That's when the investigation shifted from genetic science back to old-fashioned detective work. As Deputy District Attorney Rob Baker later described it, investigators began using traditional investigative techniques to start eliminating the brothers one by one. Hutchison dug through newspaper obituary notices, public records, and social media to track down descendants of the four brothers, building out family trees branch by branch to see which one led back to the crime scene evidence. Traditional genealogical research helped rule out three of the four brothers entirely. Through Facebook, Hutchison eventually identified a grandchild of the one brother still in question, a man named Gary Gene Ramirez. At this point, investigators still didn't have proof. They had a strong hypothesis, built from years of patient genealogical work, and a plan to confirm it the only way that would hold up in court. We're about to reach the moment this case broke open. What do you think finally cracked it? Drop your guess before you keep watching. On April 8, 2022, Hutchison obtained a DNA sample from that grandchild. The results came back with a familial link strong enough to point directly at Gary Ramirez as a likely source of the crime scene DNA. The Santa Clara County District Attorney's crime lab moved to confirm it, and shortly afterward, that confirmation came through: a match. After 40 years, the blood and bodily fluid recovered near a bus stop on El Camino Real in 1982 had a name attached to it. By then, Gary Ramirez was 75 years old. He had served in the U.S. Air Force in the early 1970s, then spent time living in Northern California, Southern California, Colorado, and finally Hawaii, where he had settled on the island of Maui. He had no criminal record whatsoever, a fact that stunned even the prosecutors handling the case. Deputy District Attorney Rob Baker later said he was surprised Ramirez's DNA had never turned up in CODIS, given that Ramirez had no record of any kind. On the surface, Ramirez's life looked unremarkable. A quiet retirement on a Hawaiian island, no red flags, no history of violence that had ever come to the attention of law enforcement anywhere he had lived. For 4 decades, he had simply been an ordinary man, living an ordinary life. A veteran, a father, eventually a grandfather, while, according to prosecutors, carrying the answer to Karen Stitt's murder in his own DNA the entire time. It is worth pausing on that fact, because it is one of the more unsettling truths this case reveals about how cold cases go cold in the first place. Gary Ramirez was never a person of interest. He was never questioned in 1982, never flagged by any tip, never connected to Karen Stitt in any way until a DNA sample pulled from his own grandchild pointed investigators directly at him. He did not evade capture by hiding. He evaded it, for 40 years, simply because no one had any reason to look at him at all. On August 2, 2022, a coordinated law enforcement operation involving Santa Clara County, authorities in Maui, and federal partners arrested Ramirez at his home in Makawao, on the island of Maui. The operation had taken months of planning. It was funded in large part by a grant the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office had received from the U.S. Department of Justice, specifically to investigate and prosecute cold cases. Ramirez made no resistance during the arrest. Days later, he appeared in a Hawaii courtroom and agreed to be extradited back to Santa Clara County, California, to face the charge that had waited 40 years for his name. News of the arrest reached Karen's family in fragments and phone calls. Karen's aunt, Robin Stitt Morris, later described the moment she learned her niece's killer had finally been identified. She had been on her last day of work before leaving for vacation when the phone rang. She nearly let it go, assuming it was a solicitor, before she recognized the voice of Detective Hutchison, the same detective she had spoken with before but hadn't immediately placed on the phone. When he told her Karen's killer had been found, she said she was floored. 40 years, she would later say, seemed to melt away in an instant, and the emotions she had buried for decades came rushing back all at once. It reopened a wound, she said, but it also brought something she hadn't expected: relief, and a measure of peace, knowing that soon her family would finally be able to write the end to this painful chapter of their lives. The path from arrest to conviction was not immediate. Ramirez's case moved through the Santa Clara County court system for more than 2 years. On February 24, 2025, Gary Ramirez pleaded no contest to first-degree murder in Santa Clara County Superior Court, after certain criminal enhancements attached to the original charges were dropped. It was, in the eyes of the law, an admission that would not be contested, the closest thing to a confession the case would ever receive. On May 12, 2025, Ramirez returned to a Santa Clara County courtroom, now 78 years old, frail, and using a cane, to be formally sentenced. Judge Hanley Chu handed down the maximum sentence available under the law that existed at the time of Karen's murder: 25 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole. Many of Karen's family members and friends were present in the courtroom that day, more than 4 decades after they had last seen her alive. District Attorney Jeff Rosen addressed the outcome directly. Over 40 years ago, he said, Karen Stitt lost her life, but she was not forgotten. He credited a dedicated detective, a persistent prosecutor, and the county's crime lab with finally putting the person responsible behind bars. Others who had carried Karen's memory for 4 decades spoke as well. Tracy Lancaster, Karen's best friend, told reporters that since Karen was brutally taken from them, there had been many unanswered questions, with why being the biggest of them all. She acknowledged that true justice would never fully exist, because nothing could bring Karen back, but said there was still a small measure of peace in knowing Ramirez would never be able to hurt anyone else again. Michael Calhoun, Karen's former boyfriend, the same young man who had walked her to that bus stop on El Camino Real in 1982, the same person who had once been wrongly suspected in her death, also spoke at the sentencing. He said that even with Ramirez finally caught and sentenced, there would still never be closure. Karen was gone. They would never get her back. Detective Matt Hutchison, the investigator who had spent years rebuilding a family tree from a single DNA sample, reflected on what finally cracked the case after 40 years of silence. The technology that identified Ramirez, he said, simply hadn't existed for the detectives who worked the case across the decades before him. It was a tool he happened to have, so he used it, because the case had to be solved. Karen Stitt was 15 years old. She was a transplant from Pittsburgh who had made a new home for herself in Palo Alto in a matter of months. A girl who could navigate a foreign bus system like a native, who spent her Thursday nights the way teenagers do, playing video games and mini-golf with a boyfriend who cared about her. She did not get to grow older than 15. She did not get to see whether Palo Alto would become the place she'd tell her own children she grew up in. For nearly 40 years, Karen's family carried a wound that could not close because the person responsible for it had no name. A machinist's memory of a strange white truck, a blood sample with no match, a boyfriend cleared by science after being doubted by suspicion, a case file that sat, patiently, waiting for the science of genetic genealogy to catch up to a mystery from 1982. It took a grandchild's DNA, submitted for entirely unrelated reasons, to finally close the distance between a killer's blood and his name. Gary Gene Ramirez is now serving a life sentence in California, eligible for parole after 25 years, a sentence that will very likely define the remainder of his life, given that he was 78 years old at sentencing. For Karen's family, the sentencing did not undo 40 years of not knowing. It did not bring her back, but it did, finally, put a name and a face to the person responsible for the last night of her life. And it gave the people who loved her the chance to say, in a courtroom, exactly what her loss had cost them. The resolution of this case has echoed beyond Karen's own family. Investigators and legal observers have pointed to it as one of the clearest demonstrations yet of what investigative genetic genealogy can accomplish when paired with patient, traditional police work. The same combination of cutting-edge science and old-fashioned persistence that identified the Golden State Killer applied here to a case that had otherwise run out of leads decades earlier. Detective Hutchison's years of work rebuilding a family tree from nothing but a DNA sample is now cited as an example of how a cold case can still move forward long after everyone involved in it has stopped expecting an answer. For Karen Stitt's loved ones, none of that changes the basic, unbearable fact at the center of this story. A 15-year-old girl went to spend an evening with her boyfriend and never came home. What changed after 40 years was that the world finally had to answer for it. Every case deserves an answer. Every family deserves the truth. If this case moved you, consider subscribing to The Silent Evidence. Every victim deserves to be remembered, and so does every family still waiting for their own answer.